Because we're a small enough group, I was hoping to just get a sense of who you all are also, but I'll introduce myself first. My name's Daniel. I teach at Marshall, predominantly fiction writing classes, some literature classes. Been in Huntington this is my 11th year, and before that I lived in Florida. Before that I lived in St. Louis. For a little over 20 years, I've been obsessed with short stories. And then much more recently, started getting really interested in playwriting. And it felt very distant from me for a long time. I would like reading plays. From time to time, I've always liked seeing them, but it felt as distant from me as music feels to me. I don't know how to play an instrument, and I thought of playwriting in that way for a long time. And then during the pandemic, sitting at home by myself, I just started thinking that it seemed approachable in a way. And the way that I began approaching it was by thinking about stories that I'd been working on that I just was never satisfied with. I couldn't make them work, and it was tempting to think of it as a failure of form rather than a failure of my own gifts and imagination. It's like, this isn't a story, this is a play. And then, so I started tinkering in that way, and then never took any classes in playwriting as a student. Took a class in Shakespeare as a student. But just through reading a lot and thinking about plays for myself, I feel like I think about those as much as I think about stories these days. So I'm coming at this definitely as a fiction writer who's pretends toward playwriting. So that's where a lot of my ideas come from. But I'm already getting ahead of myself because I was curious what connection you all have to playwriting or to theater. I know some of you, but I'd like to hear if we could.
Start on that side of the room. Oh, man.
Yeah, about theater or playwriting?
Hi, I'm Mike. I'm not. Hi, I'm Mike. I'm the artistic director of Alchemy Theater. I have been a writer most of my life in some form or another, and I started out writing short stories and poetry, and then moved on to a novel, and then that wasn't enough. So I've always been obsessed with TV and movies and seeing stuff happen live on stage, and I wanted to see what that would be like to create, and it is a very different sort of thing. And then I sort of that's where I sort of fell in love, I think, and I love seeing. I like that visceral vision, like literal vision of watching things that you have written, watching people say those words in front of you versus off the page, I think. And it also often allows you maybe to be able to rewrite more and fix things that in a short story, once it's out there, it's sort of out there, and you can't really change anything. But if you find a line that works better in a play, if you're participating in the play, you can rework it and talk to the people and say, well, just try this instead, or try this line, let's punch up this joke, or do something like that. And that always appealed to me. Because an artist's work is never done, they just eventually leave it. Or abandon it, I suppose is the quote. But I'm obsessive about that stuff, and even once it's done, like we just did a TV show that I wrote 2 episodes of, and we did a play that I wrote last Christmas, and we're about to do the sequel to that this Christmas, and I like that. I like that collaboration between the actors and people that, once they really understand the character that you've created, can offer you insight into a character that you made up. That I find that very interesting too. Yeah. That's sort of where I'm coming from, anyway.
Well, thank you.
You did an excellent job.
You're not going after that?
I'll go after you.
I'm John, and I'm a recovering actor. And I've done some acting with Alchemy Theater Troupe. I actually directed the first show Alchemy did, and the inaugural show for the inaugural West Virginia Shakespeare Festival, Midsummer Night's Dream, in 2018. I'm a musician, though that's my training and education, and weekly practice. I scripted madrigal dinners, 5 of them for a college where I taught. I've scripted for church events, whether that's just a Sunday morning scripture reading or an entire Christmas Eve program 2 years ago at the church where I'm organist. And I wrote and had a play accepted at the New Works Festival this last January, so we got to hear that. So I've done a little bit of writing, haven't gotten serious about it, but we'll be on stage here tonight, as will Mike and Nora and Joanna and Mike Negley and Stephen. Todd, you can help out somewhere. It's all right. So, well, thank you. Now, is that better? Did I soften it up for you?
Yeah, because I'm not a writer at all. I have written nonfiction a lot academically for a master's degree and all of that stuff, and I write grants. But fiction, hard. It's hard, but it's totally different. It's not the same thing at all. Although there is a lot of making things up with grant writing.
You're being filmed right now.
Oh, right. We're live. Are we live? Thank you, the West Virginia Humanities Council, for your very generous grant. Didn't make that one. It's totally real. Look, see, it's happening. Oh man, I forgot. Anyway, no, I've never written anything anything fiction ever at all. I really, really enjoy it. I'm a huge fan. It is very mystical to me, much like how an artist can apply paint to a canvas. There's a big disconnect. I understand that it happens. I even know the mechanics of it, but I'm really just a super fan of writing.
That's kind of the way I feel about nonfiction. I get it on a level, but even if I'm in a workshop like this one, sitting out there and I'm instructed by a prompt to write nonfiction, I start making things up. I'm so resistant to do it. So I think I understand.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I'm Stephen. I have written, my writing started with all the basic stuff you do in school where your teacher forces you to write something and you're like, why am I doing this? There's other people that do it better. And it turned into, I wrote several church plays for Easter and Christmas because the person who was doing it wasn't there anymore. I too have written for the New Works Festival, short plays, 10-minute plays. And in the last couple of years, I have challenged myself to write short stories, very limited in scope, 1 page or less, single space, and just forced myself to do it so I wouldn't run on. And no one has or probably will see those, but yeah, because it's an exercise for me. And I have adapted a couple of pre-written plays for different forms. Last year I took Noel Coward's Hay Fever and adapted it to film. And it was also a very British play, and I made it not so British because our actors were not British. So except for Joanna. But some things like that, I feel like I have the basis of it. I work with Mike quite a bit, so get to see his process and his screaming and beating his head against the wall. So, and he and I went to Huntington High School this past year and taught some intro, just some of the real basic stuff on how to write a play, just to get the kids' wheels moving. Like, we're not the expert, or I'm not the expert by any means, but I've done some of that. And again, super fan. Like, I love to read. So.
Thanks.
I am Todd. I pretend to be a performer. I am not.
So do all
I'm
of
not
us.
a writer. I just read what people put in front of me. And I'm here because it just seemed like it's an interesting workshop. Ms. Marchand.
Welcome.
I'm Joanna. I am an actor and not a writer. And I like Shakespeare. So I like to perform. So playwriting is a thing I like, but I do not do.
Excellent.
Well, I'm Mike. I'm behind the camera. Let's see. I've done some short story writing in the past, and oddly enough, do some puzzle narrative for a live-action Dungeons and Dragons event every once in a while. Kind of a weird thing. But yeah, other than that, not a writer at all.
Cool. Well, thank you all. Having had to do things like that, I know that you don't always look forward to having to talk about yourself. But I really appreciate it, especially to get a sense of who I'm talking to, what your backgrounds are associated with the actual process of writing. I predict that what we'll end up doing is not actually going through these exercises that I'm going to talk about, but just talking about them and thinking about how they might work. I think that's probably a better use of our time while we're together. And if you feel inspired or at all excited by any of those things, you can do them at any time. I want to start with a little bit more about just the angle that I approach all of this from, because I think it matters that I'm coming at it from a narrative perspective, the act of playwriting from like a story writing perspective rather than any experience with acting, performing, theater work at all. And when I write stories, I usually have very little idea of what's going to happen in them. I certainly have no point in mind or sort of message or anything like that, and I know some writers do. What I'm doing is it usually feels more like playing with language or playing with ideas and then surprising myself. So that sense of play, that sense of making something and being surprised by it is more important to me than thinking in advance about what that thing might mean. So I've had the experience before of writing a story, someone reading it, and then making an observation about what it means that immediately seems obvious to me, but they think I'm lying when I say, I never thought about that before, because I just shut off that kind of literary critical part of my mind whenever I'm writing. And then when I'm teaching classes in writing, I usually try to focus on technique or strategies for how to approach the actual process of writing, and I talk very little about the topic that you're writing about or the theme of what you're writing, because it's easier to learn or to teach or to talk about actions than it is to talk about the content of what you're writing. And I think the content is very personal. I can't look at somebody and predict what they want to write about, but I can help them figure out how to write about whatever. So the content feels so personal as to be very difficult to address. But of course, the craft or the technique also becomes very personal the more you write, because the more you write, the more you develop idiosyncratic aspects of that technique and that style. And that's something that also becomes personal, but the material itself feels so personal as to be sort of beside the point for me. I'm often telling students that as long as they care about what they're writing about, it doesn't matter if I already care about that thing. If their writing feels alive, then I suddenly care about that thing. Whereas if it's just if it's a topic that typically interests me and it's handled poorly, I'm no longer interested in that topic that I would otherwise be interested in. So some of the sort of people who help me form my framework for approaching narrative, I've got some quotes on the first page of the stack of handouts. There's a writer named Donald Barthelme who was a fiction writer. He died in the late 80s. He was known primarily for his kind of playful metafiction that would appear often in The New Yorker, almost exclusively in The New Yorker in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. There's a line from one of his stories called The Indian Uprising that's delivered in dialogue. a story that has wacky action taking place, and the people are speaking in a way that addresses that action, but also applies on these meta-narrative levels. And he has a character say, "Some people run to conceits or wisdom, but I hold to the hard, brown, nut-like word." And I talk about this in a lot of my writing classes because it seems to me it enacts like the principle that it talks about. Some people think about theme or message or meaning at the outset, and some people, like Bartholomew is suggesting, think much closer to the surface, think about the actual material that they're working with. And I just love the way this sentence operates. It feels like it would benefit from that kind of Star Wars scrolling text thing where you, if you're paying attention word by word, some people run to conceits or wisdom, but, so there's a contrast coming out, but I hold to that, and you're waiting, you're thinking, so what's the counterpoint to wisdom or ideas? Hard, okay, so you're thinking hard, difficult, or like this kind of hard, but brown, okay, so it's this kind of hard, nut-like, and you're like, well, what's nut-like, but not a nut? And then you're thinking, or I'm thinking, hypothetically, is an acorn a nut, technically? Or what are the things that are hard and brown and like a nut, but not a nut? And he says word, which is the ultimate abstraction. You think, well, so he just forces you to make language feel like this tactile thing. And that's the approach that I like myself and that I encourage people to think about. So often, at least people early in their writing process will just sit back trying to have a big idea rather than just start using language and letting the language surprise you in some way. Similarly, this quote from Barry Hannah, who was also a prose writer, says, "All my best stories come out of nowhere with no concern for form at all." I personally really subscribe to this approach and realize when I'm talking about it in an actual classroom, it seems to run counter to the academic purposes of the class. So I'm always talking in these idealistic ways while also trying to remain conscious of the fact that they have assignments that are due on certain dates. And be open, see where things go, be experimental, and it will be graded, and it's due in 1 week. So that kind of thing. I'm aware of it, but I often contradict it my own self. Debbie Harry of the band Blondie, she said, "Learn to play your instruments and then get sexy." Something that my advisor when I was in graduate school shared with us, and I thought that it's just fun to include, and it also makes sense if you think about, we all can define these terms for ourselves as metaphor, but thinking about just learning how to do things at a basic level before you get ahead of yourself, I think it's the way that's most exciting, or most applicable, rather. And then Ernest Hemingway, when he wrote a sort of dialogue for Esquire magazine in which he's voicing both parts of a conversation. One is Maestro, I think short for Maestro, this master writer in YC is your correspondent. So he's pretending to interview himself on a boat and asking questions about how do you write good stuff, essentially. So, well, I think I have that backwards, who's who in that dialogue. Do you know what is going to happen when you write a story? And the master character here says, "Almost never. I start to make it up and have happen next, what would have to happen next as it goes along." And I think, and a lot of writers say things like this. I think Stephen King has another famous quip along these lines about just imagining a character and kind of dropping them down and following where they go, which sounds simple, but is really difficult, I think, to try to engage with your own imagination in that way where it becomes, or feels like it's this thing that's independent of you. I think it's difficult to do and difficult to talk about for different reasons because you sound sort of wacky or like faux mystical when you really talk about like witnessing your imagination as though you don't control it. Tricky. Flannery O'Connor, again, another prose writer. I think she has two useful things for us. Anybody who has survived their childhood has enough information about life to last the rest of their days. I think that's helpful to keep in mind. more to the point of what I want to talk about today, she says, I write because I don't know what I think until I read what I say. And that's another one that other people have variations on, but this one's attributed to her. And it has a sort of wise-ass quality to it, but I think it makes sense if you're engaging with language as this hard, brown, nut-like thing that you can surprise yourself. And sometimes you might end up seeming to know or think things that you didn't even know or think before. And then Mike Tyson, I think has some things that he can teach us here. I try to catch him right on the tip of the nose because I try to push the nose into the brain. And Mike Tyson, of course, is a boxer, and this is grotesque. But if you think about it metaphorically, I feel like it's a reminder that ideas are abstract, but sensory language, appealing to somebody's senses, imagery is the way to enter into their experience and deliver those ideas. So when I came across that quote that is so off-putting, shoving somebody's nose into their brain, I thought, that's exactly what we talk about in Intro to Creative Writing. You don't begin abstractly, you begin with image, language that appeals to the senses. The nose goes into the brain. Thank you, Mike Tyson. And then he also said I could have knocked him out in the third round, but I wanted to do it slowly so he would remember this night for a long time. And I think what he's trying to talk about there is also narrative, and it has to do with being aware of the audience's experience with what you're doing and thinking, is the story or is the play going to last for 90 seconds? Or am I going to sort of control the way I deliver this experience? It's a little bit, again, off-putting if you think of yourself as the writer in this kind of pugilistic, antagonistic way with the audience, like you're going to batter them. But if you warp it a little bit, I think it makes a lot of sense. You might have an intention, an effect that you want the work to have. You have to think about the pace that it takes to maximize that effect. And I want to save that Edward Albee one for a bit. But so those are some of the things that inform the way I think about writing with respect to your audience, or writing with respect to how you interact with words, the relationship between ideas and language. All of that, to me, is informed by these ways of thinking. So just put all these things together, distill it. Writing becomes this process where you're surprised by what you're doing. And I think those are the moments that are joyful to me. There's a satisfaction to be had in having a plan and enacting that plan. But there's, to me, a more powerful satisfaction to be had in sitting down, not knowing what's going to happen, and then feeling almost like you're the audience and the creator at the same time, and actually feeling that surprise. And that's what if I get up very early in the morning to work on, to write something, I'm not excited about moving down a list of things that I know is going to happen, things that I know are going to happen. I'm excited about seeing what might happen. All that sounds very nice, but I think it can be really difficult to get started down that road. So the other things in your set of handouts there, a few of them are examples of things that I've used for story writing exercises that I think translate really well to playwriting also. The character survey, for example. And this is ultimately what I'm working toward, is thinking about ways to develop characters, including borrowing them from existing works. But this survey is something that I've used for story writing. I think it makes sense also, probably, in some version of this makes sense if you're performing, thinking about who your character is and trying to get to know them on a level beyond what is explicitly stated on the page. In a story writing class, it's very straightforward how this can become a story, because stories deal in exposition in a way that's more straightforward than drama does, I think. Sometimes it might seem old-fashioned, but the kind of stories that begin with explanations about who the people are, the place, what's going on, the old-fashioned seeming plot diagram, because exposition, rising action, climax, etc. So you can look at examples of stories that just begin with somebody almost in the order of appearance down this page, presenting this information, and then leaning into it in some places, like letting some of these things be complicated. Some of them, maybe you skip them altogether. Some of them are addressed, like age is probably not complicated, but hobbies can be complicated. Obsessions are complicated. And then I like to think of those moments in cartoons where you have a character in, say, the Flintstones or Scooby-Doo, wanting to be in motion, but their legs are moving like this. And that's what exposition feels like to me. And then there's that moment where they gain actual traction, and then they start moving in real. That to me is where something instigating or intriguing has happened. So I look at this as a way in a story to begin. Like making your way through the stuff that just feels like information until one of these things feels interesting, and it feels like there's tension connected to some aspect of this character, and then a story can develop out of that information. Different with drama, I know. I'll talk about that, or we'll talk about that in a little bit. Another one that I think could be useful is probably, okay, so this word bank thing I think can be interesting. If you're like me, when you come to a piece of writing and you don't have a point that you want to make, but you just want to explore and see what your imagination contains, sometimes I think it can be useful to apply constraints to yourself. So you've got these, choose 5 words from this list, and then try to make some kind of constellation out of those 5 words. Use them in a sentence, use them in a paragraph, and you engage a different part of your mind than your idea-driven mind. It can feel like puzzle solving, but you can all of a sudden spark some idea that you never would have had just on the wide open plane of your imagination. Similarly, I think on the back side of that one, there's a table that has 3 columns. People, and I tried to give like the real world word and then the writing term. So people / characters, tensions / conflicts, because in my experience, life is filled with tension, but rarely do I feel like I'm engaged in an actual conflict with somebody. That's just the way that I think about things. And then places are where I experience real life, and settings are where I put writing. And this is something that was presented to me when I was in I think my first fiction writing workshop. Somebody gave us these 3 columns with 3 items in each column. We had to choose one thing from each column and incorporate it somehow in a story. And I think about this as a constellation. So I didn't choose these things, and I have to make connections with them. And I can even, this was 20-something years ago, and I still remember that I chose refused charity as a tension, and I chose the road to Tucumcari, which I had to Google and find it was in New Mexico. And then I think brothers were the people, and I had to write a story that incorporated these things. I remember the exercise more than I remember the story itself. But I think, so this is a way for me of imposing constraints on the imagination that fire up ideas that you wouldn't have had otherwise. And I think you can populate this table yourself, even with things that are nonfiction, things that are from your life, but force yourself to make connections by closing your eyes and choosing things that don't necessarily go together. Or you can borrow things from existing works. And I'll talk more about that also in a minute. Imagine what that would have been like.
How mad you would have been at Tennessee Williams for trying to make it so serious.
Lighten up, dude.
It's so long.
It's so light.
Why would you take such a beautiful short play into this?
Well,
So true.
David Ives does a lot of the same thing. He'll take Shakespeare characters and parody them, and almost all of them stand alone, in my experience. Other than words, like where the monkeys are sitting around. That's just weird. But the ring stuff usually stands alone pretty well.
Yeah, I've not read all of it, but I've
Yeah.
read maybe 10 or a dozen different
I feel like-
shorter ones.
I feel like people do it with Hamlet a lot.
Is that the actor's nightmare? Is that
I don't
right?
know if it's because it's, arguably the greatest play ever written, and so people, whatever. At least that's what a lot of people call Hamlet. But like there's what's the guy's name who wrote it? There's a play called Fortinbras that takes place, like it starts at the end, like so right as Hamlet dies, and Fortinbras comes in and takes over, and it's a comedy, and everybody likes to make it kind of like, if it's a very serious play, they like their sequels or their prequels are going to be comedies for some reason.
The Desdemona I saw was a comedy.
Did you see Play About a Fingertip?
I think that's the one I saw. Yeah,
Paul
it's just
Vogel?
it's just three people.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's straight up comedy. It's
And
This
just
is
like
interesting.
in Fortinbras, it's Hamlet's ghost is continually coming back to not understanding why people aren't telling his story, like he was begging them to tell his story when he died. Like, I mean, it's that kind of thing. But it's a very good play too. But
I mean, that's one way to avoid criticism, right? You're like, I'm doing something different.
So whenever, instead of taking something and turning it into, or instead of continuing in a kind of tragic way, but trying to make it comedy, I mean, it feels like a defense to me. And I don't mean that as a criticism. I mean, that's the way it's just easier to do, it feels to me. You kind of guard yourself against certain criticisms, which is not to say that comedy's easy. I think comedy's extremely difficult.
It'd be hard to like over dramatize Hamlet.
Yeah,
That might
it
be
would feel a little silly. I think.
tough to do.
I'd be interested in Shylock is my name. We've been having a lot of discussion about Merchant of Venice lately, and because we're doing Taming of the Shrew, which is another problem play, and I haven't read Vinegar Girl either.
Yeah, I was interested in that one.
Yeah, I don't know. I came across those because they're part of that same series that Hackseed was a part of, that people taking on in novels these Shakespeare works from one angle or another. The dividing line here is things that are Shakespeare and things that are not. So the Durang stuff, adaptations of Tennessee Williams or Sam Shepard. The Raymond Carver story, I think, is really interesting, the way it tries to imagine Chekhov's final days as he's dying. It doesn't, it's fiction, but it tries to explore what is known about that experience. Then it becomes about Carver as much as it's about Chekhov. The last thing on the list is a story by Paget Powell, who was the teacher that I had in graduate school, who presented the Debbie Harry book to me, incidentally. But one of his stories is called Joplin and Dickens, and he puts Janis Joplin and Charles Dickens in the same elementary school classroom.
I am really interested in that.
It was recorded for Selected Shorts, the NPR program where they have actors read fiction. I can't remember, it was a British actor, and I cannot remember the name. But of course, there's a lot of imagination happening to make that interaction happen. But it, to me, felt relevant to what I'm talking about here, because you don't just have to borrow characters from Shakespeare. For legal reasons, that's tempting. Copyright reasons, right? And for legal reasons, borrowing real people can seem problematic, but some of them are safe. They're up for grabs, I think. And it's a fantastic story. If you can't find it, email me, because I can scan it for you if you're interested.
Another similar one that we've done as a play a couple years ago was Picasso at the La Panegile, which is a Steve Martin play. Where
Steve Martin at the banjo play?
Yes.
He
Good for banjo
wrote
fan.
a play set in a French bar where Picasso and Einstein meet. And then later in the play, Elvis shows up. It's
Steve Martin.
What if this chance meeting of these two brilliant people and the people that they interact with daily, and Yeah, he's written 3 plays, I think.
It's a musical.
Yeah, he has a musical. He and Edie Brickell wrote a musical called Bright Star, and he adapted a play called The Underpants. That was a German play, so borrowing from the Germans. And then and Picasso was his first one.
I have no idea.
Picasso de la Panagio.
So, okay, so with those examples in mind, leaning back into the Stoppard thing, or the Stoppard take on Hamlet, the main thing finally that I want to explore is how you can make something entirely original borrowing from somebody else. And in my mind, you've got you come to one major fork in the road. In one direction, you're doing things that are explicit and you're making very self-aware, so sort of acknowledging this appropriation. And when you're doing that, you have to be aware of whether it's okay to use somebody else's material or not. But there's, when you go down that road, you've come to many more forks. I think one of the early ones is, what's the relationship going to be between what I imagine and what already exists? So is it going to be like Stoppard, where these things are, intertwined? Is it going to be sort of have a kind of meta awareness where you're treating? And I guess Haxey does this to a degree. Where you're writing about people who are putting on the play. Like there's different ways that you can show an awareness of the work, or a prequel sequel kind of thing. You've got all those choices to make. Back up to that main fork, though, the other direction, you've got things that I want to be very clear are not like the kind of classic plagiarism where you seek not to be caught, but where you kind of strip down and repurpose the work in your mind and end up inspired by it or incorporating aspects of it that are become essentially unrelated, but they began in a related way. If that makes sense. So you wouldn't be writing about Rosencrantz and Guildenstern by name necessarily, but you'd think, what is it about these guys? What's their relationship to the main character? And then you can kind of reconceptualize character, just so you just take the dynamic in a sense. Or what is it that interests me about this play? Is it the fact that it turns the spotlight off of main action, and then all of a sudden you can imagine different main action and then apply. So you take that kind of concept. I like thinking about it in skeletal terms also. If you think about a play that you really love, like The Glass Menagerie, and you try to summarize it or try to create your own diagram, however your mind works, and think about what are the parts of this play. You've got your characters, Tom and Amanda, and Laura, Jim. And then you say, well, what are they without their names? And you start thinking about who they are. And then the analogy that really makes sense to me is a skeleton, where you think these are the parts that hold this thing together. And then you sort of rattle that thing and all the bones. And then what else can I build out of these parts? Mm-hmm. And then you become like, this kind of mad scientist, archaeologist figure, where you take those ideas, or those pieces rather, and then you also feel totally allowed to break things, or just like carve them up, and you just make something else out of that material. When I'm building things out of blocks with my children, this also comes to mind, where we make one thing. And so that's the play, the original play that I've read. And then my son takes great pleasure in knocking it down, and then we need to build it again. And of course, we're not going to build it the same way. We're going to make something else. And to me, that's what you can do. That's a way of being inspired by somebody's work, not in a way that seeks to be sneaky, but just internalizes the text to the point where you start transforming it yourself into something totally different. And I'm sure we have examples of this throughout all of written history. We don't even know what they are. Sometimes we do, because writers will talk about where they got their inspiration from. But a lot of times we don't, and we don't need to. I mean, we probably do this subconsciously a lot of the time, where you realize, there's some resemblance between this thing that I wrote and this thing that I loved and hadn't thought about in a long time. You can kind of identify those bones and think, okay, yeah, it used to be here, but now I've got it over here. Weird. I hope that's okay. Does that make sense as an analogy? Can you think of anything that works in a way like that?
Stephen King wrote a book called Desperation, and his pseudonym, Richard Bachman, wrote a book called The Regulators. In those two books, he has the same characters, same named characters. The characters are very different from one book to the next. The good characters in one would be bad characters in another. And Desperation is a little more straight up Stephen King, supernaturally stuff is going on in Nevada or whatever. And Regulators is a little more domestic terrorism type thing in New England. And he, when they first published the hardback versions of the book, you could sit them side by side and it made one big picture. And but that is the only way that they're related, other than he wrote them both under a different name and used different names or used the same names for all the characters and just treated all the characters very differently. And I always found that very fascinating to pick yourself apart. Yeah. And say, and I was always curious, and I don't know the answer of which he wrote first.
I was going to ask that, and then how close together? Do you have any idea?
I have no idea. They were published at the same time.
Okay.
Or right very close to each other. But that was the first time he had written a Bachman book in 20 years or something. So it was very weird. And of course he was like, Richard Bachman's dead, and we found this book. We just knocked the dust off of this book, and we're publishing it now, or whatever super rich Stephen King can do, he can do. But yeah, it was
that level of
it was a trunk novel.
The level of productivity and layering there just boggles my mind.
Yeah, especially a guy that can write 1,000-page books twice a year.
Yeah.
Or at least just crank them out, whether he's hit by a minivan or not. He wrote more books while he was in the hospital. All trunk novels, I'm sure. I'm sure he probably has 5 novels at any given time that he can pull out and say, let's do this one, because I haven't written anything this year. Whereas George R. Martin can't write a single book in 30 years.
Well, Stephen King's, every once in a while I'll come across a quote that seems really useful, and I'll realize that, he's essentially doing, it feels to me like an activity that's so far away from, he's like I might as well be 9 feet tall as be able to write 1,000 pages in a year. So what works for him, it almost doesn't feel applicable. Every once in a while, something. I do find myself getting use out of some of those ideas.
Movies and television do it all the time. And if that's not because of form, they'll say something's based on whatever, and you're like, was it? But it could be that picking up some bones.
Yeah.
But again, if you're playing with film or television or even a short story, that's way different than drama. That's the stage or the stage form is going to be way different. And for a television show that ripped itself, Newhart went into Newhart, and he was the same character, but it was completely different environment, and it was just that character doing a new thing. And again, they brought the actor along, but I think you see it all the time with television and movies. Well, we've talked about 10 Things I Hate About You.
I was thinking about 10 Things.
Well, or Forbidden Planet. Those are all very loosely based.
Yeah, when I was starting to make that list, after a few films, I just thought,
movies.
I'm going to cut these out because there's too much. And then I started thinking about, does The Lion King qualify?
Right. She's the man.
And I just had to just take those out of the list altogether. Well, in the interest of time, let me get through a couple of other things here. That page with the quotes, the one from Edward Albee. So the same guy who I went to see do Rosencrantz and Guildenstern took me to see Edward Albee speak at a time when I did not know it was happening. Also there, it's like, yes, I'll go with you to this event at this enormous synagogue down the street from our apartment. And it's like a playwright, interesting. And then I saw the crowd of people, and I thought, I'm going to remember this name. Later on, I'm going to figure out what's going on here today.
Oh, no.
But I don't remember anything about the talk, but then later, when I came to really admire his work, I'm glad that I did remember that he was the person that I saw. He gave this answer in an interview about how well he knows his characters when he starts on a play. And I think this gets at, to me, what is a really central difference in my approach, what I think is a sensible approach for playwriting versus story writing. Because I think in playwriting, it's essential to know something about these people before you get started, because trying to develop exposition and dialogue is just deadly. The kind of discovery that can happen in a story that feels organic and exciting feels to me like very slack or self-indulgent if you're writing it as conversation. Like, what is your name? My name. What is your name? Like that kind of stuff. You just have to know some things, I think. And maybe that exposition, developing dialogue can be a drafting tool, but it certainly doesn't feel like the kind of thing you want anyone to experience. But I liked what Albee had to say about his relationship to his characters. He said, I conduct an experiment to find out how well I know my characters. I will take a walk on the beach and think up some situation that can't be in the play that I'm planning to write. For a half hour or so, I'll walk around with my characters, making them improvise dialogue for that situation. And if I can see and hear them existing, that ought to say, three-dimensionally in an improvised situation, that indicates to me I probably know them fairly well, and maybe I can trust them to be in my play. And that, to me, sounds very sensible, even though it's not the way that I operate as a prose writer.
And then you can count your trip to Hawaii as a business expense.
Everything becomes the whole life in service of the business.
To get to the beach.
So when I think about this in the context of my classroom experience, it sounds perfect, but then you think, well, how do I expedite this process? How do I get to know characters? And I think some of the same things, that's the survey idea is a way to get to know a character, to force yourself to do it. But the idea of borrowing works here also, of course, because if you've seen a play, let alone been in a play, you know those characters and you can think about them. And, you can write something based on this character that you've inhabited in a way that's acknowledging that or exploring that in an explicit way, or you can think, what's my personal connection with this character, and how can I kind of transfer that into a sort of fraternal twin who then develops differently, has no relationship to the plot of the play, but just a shortcut to getting to know somebody rather than beginning with zero. Or you can do you know a character from a play. Can you drop them in the situation of another play? And all of a sudden you're already started. And then you just play around with this kind of dialogue he's describing that he's inventing for his invented characters. And you take somebody from The Glass Menagerie, you take somebody from Taming of the Shrew, you pretend time doesn't exist. You put them in some other situation, and you know who they are. So what would they say to each other? And then all of a sudden, a conflict or a tension might even arise out of that if these characters have something between them that you can see would precipitate that tension. And it feels to me like it has the potential to be silly, good or bad, but it has the potential for you to surprise yourself. And if you can't help but make it personal, you just need a way to start your own imagination, your own process. And if you take somebody else's characters and force yourself to remove them from their original situation, you're now relying on your own improvisational skills or your own imagination, your own sort of passions or oddity. Another narrative activity that I've used that I think applies here is giving people the first paragraph or a bit of early dialogue from something they've never read before, and asking them to just copy this paragraph and then finish the story. And then just chop off that first paragraph, as long as they're not using iconic names. This bears no resemblance whatsoever to any source text. You've just given them a direction and made them, it almost acts as a safety net. Well, I'm just doing what I have to do. This isn't me exposing my inner self. And then you realize afterward, well, it's exactly what I did. I just didn't realize that's what I was doing. So that, again, feels to me like something you can do with drama. I don't want to say very easily, but very straightforwardly. Difficult, but you can take these known quantities and make something brand new out of them, and nobody might even realize what you've done. This happens to me a lot when I feel like I don't have much to say, and then I take all the time.
Listen, the next one is postponed, so you got all the time in the world. However you want to do it.
I was, if the pair felt right to actually do writing, which usually whenever I have those kinds of plans, I end up realizing that I feel too, I ask people to do something and then I start talking again. The quiet bothers me. The activities I was going to encourage people to try would be filling out that survey on behalf of a character that you know pretty well. And you would definitely end up exploring things about that character beyond what is spelled out on the play that they come from. I'm sure the play doesn't address every single one of those things. Just imagining a scenario to drop them in, and you've already short-circuited a lot of the slow simmering that has to happen before you write something of your own. I also came across something on the website LitHub fairly recently, where somebody, for reasons unknown, this was on August 18th on LitHub, decided to frame Shakespeare's plays as Daily Mail headlines, which is the tabloid headline kind of thing. That's awesome.
Nice.
So The Taming of the Shrew, for instance, becomes woman dazzles after slimming down thanks to Petruchio's, miracle diet. The poorest service is repaid with thanks, and so shall mine before you touch the meat. Romeo and Juliet becomes Juliet, flaunts her toned physique and skimpy morning attire hours after her cousin's murder. Remembers her only love sprung from her only hate. Ophelia showcases her svelte gans as she wades into the river, head of the world debut of Boy Toy Hamlet's play. So,
Nice.
These are, they're fun if you get it. It's still like the kind of thing that exists for no discernible reason, even though it's amusing. But the reason why it seemed useful to me, or as the prompt for something that could be generative, is that gives you a comic take on the idea of thinking about what happens in the play and reframing, thinking about it in different terms. So that's another way of sort of envisioning the skeleton and then making something else out of those bones. So even if you had no experience with Hamlet or the Taming of the Shrew, and you absorbed a possible story behind that headline, there's your version of that play without even knowing that play. So you take something that you know and just try to amuse yourself by reframing it as a headline, and then you write the story that embodies that headline in a way. Just another way of imagining bones and repurposing bones.
Sounds like an easy way. Well, I don't say easy. One way to do that is to just change point of view.
There you go.
Yeah, because so much of Shakespeare is in the main character's head or in the viewpoint. So switching to the headline, somebody on the outside looking in, seems like a very natural way to jump at it.
Yeah, and another one that you've still got that first fork in the road where it could be, explicit, or it could be, it could be layers. You can veil it in a way. Yeah. Or, at the back of that set of handouts, there's a stapled one that gives the opening to the Taming of the Shrew, and then the character descriptions from the Glass Menagerie, because I'm never not talking about that. And pretend that you're not familiar with these things. And I think the Glass Menagerie lends itself well to this. Just read those character descriptions and think, okay, well, a mom who's like this, and a son who's like that, what might happen between them? And you've got the sort of safety net of this being somebody else's idea in a way, and then you've got sort of free reign to imagine, to build something else within those confines. And then, again, the character tension place table, I think, is pretty self-explanatory, but you could populate that with characters that you know from existing works and places, conflicts, etc. And then make some kind of new constellation. And then, were we actually writing, I would say my immediate goal would be for you to be able to create a character who feels ready to talk and move and feel in that way that Edward Albee imagines for his own self, or to be able to start writing a conversation that feels like it has something beneath its surface that isn't merely exposition. And that larger goal is to take inspiration from somebody else's work, borrow something from it, and possibly transform it into something that nobody else would even recognize the connection between your work and that source work. I think that basically covers the stuff that I wanted to talk about. I was curious if these things brought to mind any, we've already been doing some of this, but other works, if works come to mind that you think do these things already, or if any ideas come to mind for things that you would be interested in. You get to do that thing where you imagine something without doing it, which is the best of both worlds. As somebody who's never acted in anything other than social situations, I don't know what it's like to inhabit a character, that is not some version of myself. But I think it seems like it would be a lot of fun to, that character in a way that's unique to you. There's a way to take parts of that and sort of create something that is, a cousin that doesn't have to be that character anymore.
I think your perspective is really interesting. It is for me, and probably for all of us, as we're a lot more familiar with Shakespeare as the playwright. But leading up to us producing The Taming of the Shrew, I was on a podcast discussing The Taming of the Shrew one act at a time. And I was invited because I produce theater, and it's about Shakespeare, and we have the Shakespeare Festival. And I got about halfway into discussing Act 2 before I realized that the other two people on the podcast were coming at it from a literary perspective, and I was coming at it from a theatrical perspective, and how specifically that play as a problem play, one of the other people on the podcast would say, like, well, no, I mean, you can go back and see that Petruchio's intentions are, they're good here, and you can see the intricacies of his character and the development and all of this. And the whole time I'm thinking, there is no way you can portray that. There's no way. First of all, it's 5 acts, and you never perform all 5 acts, right? Or you don't perform all the words in all the acts, right? And I realized that we were coming at it from very, very different forms. And that Shakespeare was written as, as plays, but often, and probably, it sounds like in your experience, you've studied it more as literature. And I don't know, it's.
And at the time that those plays were written, people weren't reading them. Like there was no, right? They it
weren't
wasn't
in book
like
forms.
You just went out and bought a copy and read it.
And now we have whole classes where we just read it and we never perform it or anything like that. So it's just a very different take, and I wonder how are there a lot of other playwrights that are like that? I mean, I think Tennessee Williams probably, and what are some others that you've studied specifically as literature that were actually written as theater?
Well, the only one that I've ever studied, as a student is Shakespeare. I didn't major in English in college, but I flirted with it for a bit and took a Shakespeare class. So that's the only playwright that I ever wrote papers about.
Right.
Shakespeare. The people that I've sort of studied because I studied on my own because I was going to be using their work in a class I was teaching. Tennessee Williams is the main one. The ones that I've sort of studied just to sort of understand how the form works, it skews awfully male and awfully 20th century. But again, Tennessee Williams, Albee, Sam Shepard, in a sort of a rut that I struggled to get out of. But those are the ones that I've studied the most. And then I also go back, I contacted that friend from college and say, what was that play that I saw you in where you said X? And he's like, oh, that was The House of Yes by Wendy McLeod. And so I'd start reading her. So my approach to it has been pretty scattered.
I thought your character survey was very insightful because often in productions we ask performers to do this work. So coming from your side, that's very interesting that in short fiction or long fiction, that's an approach you take because often in drama we ask the performer to take that responsibility.
Yeah.
Even outside the director. The director doesn't necessarily make those choices.
And those questions tend to be, what do you say? What does your character say about your character? What do other characters say about your character? And how do those two things meet in the middle? Like, whether he acts one way and people say something different about him, or or whatever. You take as much information out of the text as you can to say, there's a very specific thing that I've had several great playwriting teachers, and Vincent Cardinal and Charles Smith, and one of their biggest tenets was, if you write something that you want to be specific, write it specifically. And while that sounds simplistic in its own terms, the idea is, if you want that character to wear a red dress, someone should say, that is a beautiful red dress you're wearing. Because until it becomes public domain, it has to be a red dress forever, due to copyright. So if you don't want people messing with your stuff, then you have to make it as specific as it matters to you. If it doesn't matter to you, then whatever. But if you say, give me a glass of Pappy Van Winkle, then somebody better have a fake bottle of Pappy Van Winkle that they're pouring, because they're certainly not going to be able to afford a real one in the show. But it's that kind of idea that what do these characters do? How do they act? How do they act toward other people? How do other people act toward them? What do they say? And that sort of all becomes this, like, here's what the play tells you about this person. Everything else, you're going to have to make up on your own.
Okay. And we'll go so far as to talk about what their history was and what's going to happen to them after the action of the play. That's often a great question if you're taking that leap, is, okay, here's what's going to happen afterwards. How do I get there?
I find this fascinating because I've never participated in that process. And I'm thinking about all the analogs to fiction writing. That when we talk about characterization, you can characterize, you can establish who a character is through what they do, what they say, how people respond to them. If somebody acts scared of this guy, even though he never does anything scary, we know he has the capacity to be scary at other times, outside the story. And the way you're describing it is just more methodical and thorough for everybody.
I did something, I was writing madrigal dinners, and then I shifted it to Christmas dinners for college, where I directed the choirs. And they'd done this for 26 years when I got it, when I went there. And so instead, I shifted it from Elizabethan England, first into Jacobean England, but then Frontier Tennessee. It was in Tennessee around the time to celebrate the bicentennial Tennessee statehood, December 95, December 96. And the next year, I set the dinner in 1943 in the New York Ballroom. But I did something I'd never done. I had the students in my chamber choir, who were going to be the actors, come up with the name, and write a biography. And then I took those names and those biographies, and that played into the script I wrote for the evening. Well, the result was they were very believable as those characters. Now, a year later, I left that next summer. Well, I was invited back because the theater director said, "Can we use your script again?" And they actually paid me for it, which was nice, and invited me back to see it. And I saw it, and he had taken exactly that script, including the biographies that earlier year had written, and just gave them those characters. And they were much more cardboard, you know. But I thought, well, you know, if I can incorporate that somehow, or if that script were to have legs for anybody else, but say, look, you know, this segment of it, you all have to write yourselves.
So it makes them more invested.
Oh, they were much more invested. That's right. It was a much richer experience for those students, and therefore for the audience. You know, turned them loose a bit, and that was like, oh, I wish I'd done this all along, or found ways to do that. You know, here or there.
Yeah, that's exciting.
I feel like for the playwright, though, that's pretty scary.
For the playwright, yes, it is. It is.
Like, I'm thinking about Cozy, and I'm thinking about Equity, and all these people that now have all these opinions about. Like, I don't think Emily would do that. That's not the thing Emily would say. Like, she absolutely no. You know, like I'm kind of imagining that's probably what's going to happen.
You're going to have to fight that constantly.
Right, I know. I mean, because that's the risk you take, right? When it's collaborative versus, you know, solitary.
Especially once you have a writer's room, because then you specifically are asking for other people's opinions, and then the way we're working on Equity now, which is a 10-episode show, is that we have other people writing episodes, and the episodes come to me. I wrote the first two, and now I have to basically go through what they wrote, and we have a Bible for the show, and it's like, you know, here's what these characters would or wouldn't do. Here, you know, these people don't relate to these people, you know, whatever.
But it's pretty basic. It's not.
It's fairly basic, and so
a lot of room.
there's always room on each side of that, but then, you know, you get some stuff where someone acts. Where a character, they have these other writers have had a character do something like wildly inappropriate for a character. And you have to sort of pump the brakes and say, okay, let's pull this back and say, I like the gag. Let's have this character who's more likely to do that gag. Maybe do that than this character that you have. You know, so that's why ultimately I think everything comes back to me, and I have to. I end up making the final draft of the thing that they've written, but that's how our writers' room is working for Equity in particular. So.
Where do you usually start? Is it a character, or is it a turn of phrase? Is it a place that you visited? Where do you normally start?
Well, with stories, it's usually a sentence, like a first sentence will come to mind, and I'll like the way that it sounds, and I'll think, well, what might happen next? And then when I end up feeling satisfied, the way that, you know, so that sentence will contain in it just, you know, like a rhythm or an image or some kind of, it'll be loaded somehow, and I'll have a sense of the direction it'll go, and then I'll write a draft of it pretty quickly, and then spend a long time refining that. But that's the process that I like. And then my experience, which is much more limited with playwriting, has been often transforming stories that don't work. So with plays, I did all of my pre-work because I tried to do something else and it failed. And so the play becomes then thinking about that narrative material in a different way. That makes sense. But I've got a sort of a world in mind, and I'm just trying to think. I'm aware that I'm deceiving myself, but I can kind of indulge in this deception where I'll think this doesn't work as a story because I'm too preoccupied with language and tone, and just I can't. Is it this word? Is this right? Like, well, as a play, the language becomes, this is the delusion or the deception. Well, language is less of an issue here. This is more transparent. This is just content, or this is just material for somebody to interpret, or this is just words that are being said, or very efficient language to indicate motion and appearance. And then I still end up spending an enormous amount of time tinkering with that language that's meant to be more transparent.
Can you give an example of something that you were stuck on in a story that you turned into a play that the play fixed for you?
Yeah, so I had a story that I worked on for a long, long time about, let's see, an older couple whose adult son still lived at home for reasons undetermined, and one day brought home in his truck from wherever he was coming from, was undetermined, and in the back of his truck he had another man who was tied up. And I thought, that seems fun. What's going on here? But I didn't want to just decide what was going on. I was trying to imagine it more from the point of view of the father and think, how does he deal with this thing? And I tried writing this as a story for a long time, and it felt, I just didn't feel like I knew enough about it, or it started to feel like I was forcing things in a way that felt inauthentic. And then I thought, well, it might be fun to, even though the play has its own point of view, it felt like a different treatment of point of view to write it as a play rather than from the mouth of a character or from the mind of a character. So what had been like maybe a 24-page story that just didn't feel right became like a 70-page play that was still felt very strange. It still had a lot of unknown quantities in it, and I was thinking about how some of those things can be, this might seem like lazy writing, but can be a collaborative experience with who's inhabiting those roles. Like some of the relationships can be informed by that. But the main thing that the play afforded me was the possibility that people could get killed. And if I kept trying to write the story from the point of view of the dad, and then when I wrote it as a play, I realized he could die. And I didn't want to write it as a third-person story. I became very enamored with the dramatic version of it, the play version of it. Does that make sense? And just a whole world of possibilities opened up to me, and it was also extremely fun because I felt like I'd been thinking about stories for so long that I felt kind of just too aware of what I was doing, and I knew I had so much less experience with plays that it was just like I was let out at recess. Nobody had any expectations for what the play would look like. I showed it to some friends, and I got reactions like, huh. Thanks for allowing me this window into your process.
Have you got to hear your plays out loud?
No.
We have a perfect venue that you could be able to.
I tried to get him to be part of the New Works Festival earlier in the year, but he was busy.
I had a conflict that time. Now I'm extremely interested.
Yeah.
It's
so fun.
As a writer, it's fun as a performer because you get something brand new.
Yeah.
But as a writer, it's fascinating to get to hear your stuff for the very first time, or heartbreaking,
Or terrifying.
I think hearing anything out loud is the easiest way to find out what doesn't work. I mean, even simple things like dialogue and how people are talking to each other. Like David Mamet writes in such a way that he's almost, I'd say this like it's a criticism of a guy that's super famous, but like it's almost overly conversational between his characters because he writes how he believes people talk to each other, and they do in an interrupting repetition. Constantly, they talk about Mamet on the phone. It's always yes, yes, right, no, that isn't, no, but but it's
I had a scene like that not long ago in a movie written by you, as a fact.
I can't imagine. And so like that sort of hearing that stuff out loud, and if you're intentionally doing it, then you can say, oh, that works. Or you start to hear how two people interact with each other, and you're like, why is he saying thank you instead of thanks? Why is he, it's always those little things, like when you're watching TV shows and people never say goodbye when they hang up the phone. It's like, do it because of time, but when you're watching it on stage, it's all very weird.
The writer Dennis Johnson is another favorite of mine, and known primarily as a prose writer, but he also wrote poetry and plays. And I've come to appreciate.
He can be pretty gritty.
Yeah.
I mean, he really is.
Yeah, his most famous book was probably Jesus' Son, which was turned into a film. So, a lot of gritty stuff, a lot of addicts, a lot of crime. But he also wrote some plays that were fascinating to me because he wasn't primarily a playwright. So that also felt like a useful example. But the reason I mention him now is that something he would do when he was teaching from time to time is pay people in the theater department to come to his fiction workshops and have them perform the dialogue of his students' stories. And it was this really informative exercise for everybody, I think, for people to hear those things said aloud. The other thing that for me is very different when I'm trying to imagine something as a play is that people have to talk more. And I'm aware that in stories, I tend to summarize and paraphrase and sort of stylize just the delivery of something. And so I'd write entire scenes that were just people kind of like grunting and moving around. That's probably why my early readers sort of...
Thank you for letting us into your process. The other thing too, like the big difference maybe between film and stage is the big thing with film is show, don't tell, because you have that medium. You can show the things happening, whether there's dialogue or not. On stage, you have to talk about it.
Right.
Yeah.
And you have to draw the attention, because on film you get to decide where the attention is as the editor.
And at the same end, and editors make or break most film or TV. But also when you're on stage, you don't want to talk about action happening. You want that action to be happening.
But Shakespeare does that a lot.
Yeah.
He talks about the action off stage.
Oh, constantly. It's nonstop. Well, you should have seen what happened over there. It was crazy. Like,
would have cost a lot of money to shoot.
Yeah, that's from Hamlet.
Well, a whole other set, and you don't have room for it.
Right, and another 15 actors that you don't have. It's a strange thing to consider having to, and it goes to the exposition of short stories or novels and stuff. Like, you still have to get all of that information out, and whether you're having people say that information or you're having people read that. And I think that's why, to me, it got a little more tiresome for me writing fiction, was because I never liked to write the exposition. One of the reasons my novel worked, if it worked at all, was because the guy I wrote it with, a writing partner who was very good at all the description and all the exposition and writing stuff, and I could handle people talking to each other. And that sort of led me into writing plays and this stuff, because that's all that happened. I don't have to worry about any of the others.
Yeah.
So
I feel like I identify more with the other guy. So that playing with plays became this kind of interesting challenge. Primarily because I was home, I wasn't going to work in spring of 2020.
How do you feel about like sequelization stuff, since we're talking about like ongoing television shows and that kind of thing? Like, as far as the borrowing concept of here are these pre-established things, and now we're going to write 48 seasons of whatever.
I feel like now I'm kind of forced to say that even though I like encourage this imaginative activity, I don't usually enjoy people doing it. I respect the integrity of the thing itself. Don't feel like you have to squeeze every last bit out of it.
Did you say Star Trek? Is that what you did?
No, I'm not going to get on anyone's toes with particular titles. But I find myself as a viewer or as a reader or an audience person thinking, oh, come on, just let it go.
Haven't finished this yet.
I have this other part of my mind that's just wants to imagine ways to start a writing project. How can we start something? So that idea, I like that idea, even though when somebody first, or there'll be a new series based on a character from an old series. I just think, not for me.
Another style.
Any other questions, anybody? Daniel, thank you so much.
Thank you.